Okay, let's talk about different cybersecurity strategies that were used in the past and that are also being used nowadays. Now, choosing a strategy is important so you know what to do in all case scenarios. In this section, we will mention a few strategies that were widely used. Let's start off with a rather old strategy, which is protect and recover. This strategy focuses on preventing an attacker from compromising a network by investing in protection technologies such as firewalls, demilitarized zones, proxy servers, and micro-segmentations. For example, firewalls played a big role in the past where worm attacks were no longer theoretical and when they started targeting Windows devices. Now, Windows devices were throughout the time targeted the most simply due to the fact that they are most common devices out there. Worms would exploit a vulnerability and infect more and more devices, but implementing firewalls such as Windows firewalls put a stop to most of them. So when an attacker tried infecting a network or a device, he or she now had another step to overcome, which was a firewall. However, once the firewalls and demilitarized zones were being implemented and protect and recover strategy was being used, people were starting to realize that this one had its own weakness. The weakness is that it was thought that the company or network using this strategy will be able to operate good protection in 100% of cases, which we all know by now that it is not possible. And the only thing they focused on in case of the attack was backup or data recovery. They thought that if the company was so good at protection, then why should it invest in detection and response capabilities? So they never did. Their only plan was, if the company's data gets compromised, well, then they will just restore the data from a backup. However, history showed that many companies that got compromised also used this strategy. Now, we could say that it could be due to the fact that nothing was being invested in detection and response capabilities. Therefore, even if the company got compromised, they wouldn't really know it. This specific strategy relies too much on network administrators, vendors that create firewalls and other security softwares to not make any mistake when it comes to configuration, which is something that we can't really rely on. If they do make a mistake, then we are once again having a vulnerable network. Now, besides this, there were also some other concerns when it comes to this strategy. First of all, not much is being done for the vulnerability management part. While firewalls can hold on the attack, we should also be finding out the vulnerabilities on our own and uninstalling vulnerable software and replacing it with a different and more secure one, or simply just patching the current one. Besides this strategy also doesn't address any type of insider threats or weak or stolen credentials, which is a common vulnerability even nowadays. And also, if the attacker gets access to the network, there is nothing stopping him from moving laterally inside the network and gaining more and more privilege, therefore being able to do more and more damage. That would be main reasons why this strategy is not complete, as it shifts its entire focus on protecting and not detecting. Alright, another strategy that is widely being used is endpoint protection strategy. Now, since we already covered and learned the endpoint protection, you can assume what this strategy is all about. It simply focuses on protecting various endpoint devices and securing them the most, since these devices are the ones holding the important data. This strategy covers investing in various antivirus and anti-malware softwares, various vulnerability management softwares, host-based firewalls, application whitelisting, and web browser protections. All of this can be done in layers for additional security. Now, as with every other strategy, this one has its pros and cons. Logically, we have a non-secure device being targeted. It's much more likely that it will not get compromised if we have various endpoint protection solutions running on that device, since those antivirus and endpoint protection softwares would be able to detect and prevent attack taking place. Whether that being a vulnerability exploitation or social engineering phishing attack, it doesn't matter, these softwares are made to stop that. But that is not always the case. See, all of these softwares that you use to protect yourself and that you count on every single day is also something that a black hat hacker can download and run on their own machine. This allows them to test their programs and their Trojans as much as they want against these endpoint security softwares and try to bypass them. Another thing that makes it easier for them is that there are many types of malicious softwares out there. As we learned before, there are ransomwares, Trojans, rootkits, and many other which can make it harder for an antivirus software to be able to detect every single one of them. Then the attacker, as we said, tests multiple malicious programs against the antivirus software, and in case one or more of them manage to bypass it and not get detected, then the attacker can use that malware to target devices that are running this specific endpoint protection software, because it won't be able to protect them at all. Another thing that can be a problem is malicious programs that try to disable or close the antivirus softwares. That's why antivirus softwares usually should have higher privileges so things like this don't happen. Besides these, there are other problems with just using this strategy, such as present vulnerabilities in these protection solutions that could also lead to compromise. Also, choosing a good one is always important, since many of them can have late patches, which leads to you being open to a certain vulnerability even after it's discovered. These protection softwares rely on a person installing it on their device, which is also something that many people don't do. And also there is big variety of vulnerabilities out there, and we mentioned it's rather hard to protect against all of them. And besides this, we also have many of different choices when it comes to using an endpoint protection software, so someone who doesn't know much about security or these softwares in general might not always choose the best one. Okay, so that would be the main idea behind this strategy. As with most of these strategies, using just one is not advised, but combining multiple strategies is the way to go, since all of them have their pros and cons, and combining them might just give you a better layered security. Okay, let's talk about application-centric strategy. Its name pretty much tells us what this strategy is all about. Focusing on application security, but putting much more focus during development. Why is this important? Well, you wouldn't want to just create an application and straight away publish it without performing any type of security checks on it. These checks should be performed during development multiple times until the team is certain that no vulnerabilities are present. This strategy requires more money, of course, but that is only if we consider that your application never gets compromised. If it does get compromised because you haven't implemented any security checks during development, then it might cost you a whole lot more compared to if you just implemented security strategies properly. So instead of just a person or a company or a smaller team, just creating the application and straight putting it out on the open for people to use, they should slow down, and at every important step of the application production, they should perform a security check. Usually these checks are performed on the application code itself, seeing if there are any bugs or buffer overflows or incorrectly implemented functions. There are many things that the development team should consider checking, and not just inside the application, but also the environment to where you are deploying the application. There are other advanced things to check, such as perhaps different libraries or APIs that you are using. Your code might be bug-free, but if you import a library, for example, that has a vulnerable function, and you call that function inside of your code, well, then your code also has a vulnerability that origins from that library. Few things that the development team should add during production is static code analysis, which is done multiple times and not just once. A threat model is also needed, and it's important to perform final checks before the application is put out to public, since testing the final product is most important because only then is application complete. Penetration tests come in handy here, as they are used to discover vulnerabilities and then patch them. A few downsides or disadvantages of these strategies are that its business value is hard to prove. While all of this sounds good, you have to convince the company to grant funds in order for security practices to come in. Someone who is not from security branch might not understand the importance of these testings performed before the application is put out, and therefore might not want to invest too much into it. And these other two we already mentioned, which are developers have to produce vulnerability-free source code, which is hard to do, especially if the code is larger. And also there is always a possible threat from third-party libraries that we import into our code. Nonetheless, this would be short theory behind another cybersecurity strategy, and as with all the others, this one too should be combined with other strategies for maximum security. Alright, another important strategy that should be implemented everywhere. The identity-centric strategy. Now, since the beginning of the internet, it was important to separate one another, to know who is who, and to be able to identify each person on the network, especially if you have a larger company with a lot of employees. In many cases, companies got compromised through authorization and authentication methods, whether that being a weak authorization strategy or stolen and weak credentials, it doesn't matter. What matters is that strong authentication can not only improve security, but it can also help us find out how we got compromised. Nowadays, when you log in to some website or you join your company network, you have lots of things that could potentially identify you. The most obvious one that grants you the access is the password. But password is not the only thing that helps identify you to the network or to some website. Other metadata can be obtained as well, and besides that, there are other things such as your email address or mobile phone that you link to the account in 99% of cases, which helps identify you through two-factor authentication. These are just the standard things, but there are other things as well that, for example, a website can follow and store. One of them is from which device are you logging in? Is it the same device that you use all the time? Is it a different device? What operating system is your device running? What browser are you using? Is it a personal device or a company device? Besides that, it should also check incorrect login or failed login attempts. This can sometimes be important when finding out if a device is getting compromised. If the log systems detect an unknown device for a certain account that tries logging in incorrectly multiple times, it might flag it as an attack. You probably have noticed on many websites that it will give you a certain amount of tries to log in. Usually that number is around 5 attempts. Now, this can be bypassed if it's configured to check this based on an IP address. For example, many websites implement this, but they tie the try attempts to the IP addresses from where they are coming from. So what an attacker can do is try 5 times from one IP and then change his or her IP address and try again. They can essentially do this as much as they want. However, brute force attacks on online accounts are not that practical unless you have a clue of what the password might be. This is because they are far slower compared to offline brute force attacks. Now, downside of using this strategy correctly is that it is rather complicated and expensive to implement. You have to collect and process all of this metadata from users and analyze it for possible intrusions and attacks. Many companies and websites also implement multi-factor authentication, however, they don't put it or they don't implement it everywhere. So some parts are usually left open for an attack without the attacker having to authenticate from additional device or email. But nonetheless, this is a good strategy that every company or website should implement to protect themselves and their users. Data-centric strategy. This one is once again a no-brainer as to what it focuses on. Well, it focuses on data, right? And data was discovered to be of most value when it comes to protecting assets. We already talked about it before, that data is one of the most important assets when it comes to creating a strategy, and that strategy has to differ when compared to the ones covered before, such as, for example, endpoint protection strategy. The reason is that data is transferable, and if we, for example, let's say have a well-protected device holding important data, we can say it is protected with heavy endpoint protection software such as most updated antiviruses and firewalls and bunch of monitoring tools that always keep an eye on any suspicious activity. While this itself can stop an attacker from compromising the network or the device and getting the data stored on that device, what happens is, if, for example, this data is transferred to a different, less secure device, well, in that case, the attacker can attack that other device, exploit it, and get the data that was on it, essentially compromising company's data in some sense. That's why just endpoint protection strategy wouldn't necessarily work on the data protection. Because of this, security experts focused on the data itself and how they can protect it no matter where and how it gets transferred. Well, the solution to this was the implementation of encryption and key management. No matter where and when the data gets transferred, if it's encrypted, the chances of it being decrypted and read are far smaller than if the data was just transferred in plain text or unencrypted. Encrypting all the files reduces the attack surface by shifting the focus from protecting all the files to protecting a much smaller number of encryption keys. Now, besides reducing the attack surface, encryption also buys organizations time. That, in a sense, means that properly encrypted data looks the same as random noise, and without the keys to decrypt the data, it will take likely many years of effort for attackers to decrypt a portion of the data. So in other words, it is based on the attacker himself just quitting because he can't really decrypt the data in any reasonable amount of time. In other words, this strategy is implementing data loss prevention and key management, and data loss prevention can be a powerful tool to help prevent data from leaving an organization in an unauthorized way, including malicious and non-malicious data theft and leakage. Data loss prevention can also monitor data that moves via the network, email, USB drives, and other removable media. However, as with every strategy, this one also has cons, such as being rather difficult to implement, and key management can be challenging for some organizations. This strategy, as the others, is meant to be combined with strategies such as endpoint security and physical security. Okay, another important strategy ahead, which is the attack-centric strategy. This strategy focuses on the attackers themselves. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you always want to know how the attackers think and what process does the attacker go through when planning out the attack on a certain company or a website. Which specific steps does he or she take? And by analyzing multiple attack scenarios and history of the attacks that happened, you can then act accordingly. So a hacker usually goes through several stages when targeting something. Now, it's not always the case that the events will play out in this order, but it is the most common to go through these steps in order. These steps are footprinting or information gathering stage, where the attacker gets as much information as he can about his target. This can be anything that he might find useful later in the gaining access phase. And after that comes scanning, which essentially is discovering different technologies on the target system, from open ports to operating systems running to different services and softwares that are running on that machine, and also including the security measures such as firewalls and antivirus softwares. The exploitation phase or gaining access phase is the attacker finally getting access to the target machine by either exploiting an existing vulnerability, whether it being a software vulnerability or someone's weak credentials, but in many cases it is also a phishing or social engineering attack. And after that, the attacker proceeds with his post-exploitation scripts and maintaining access on the target system. Now, the attack-centric strategy essentially takes these steps and creates countermeasures for them. Each of these steps has a countermeasure that also consists of three things, which are protection, detection, and response. For example, let's take scanning into consideration. Maybe you don't want your device being scanned and anyone being able to extract any type of information with their scans. You could set up a firewall to act as a protection mechanism. This way, your ports would show as filtered to the attacker when running the scans, and this is of course considering your firewall is well configured. You could also have someone or some tool log and detect malicious type of scans on your machine, and to respond to that, you could block the IP address that the scans are coming from. These are the three things that this strategy focuses on. Of course, this one is once again quite costly to implement and to operate, since it does usually require expertise from multiple vendors in order to run the tools that are used to protect, detect, and respond to various types of threats.